Hello, welcome to La Excellence. I am Harsha Mannava and we are discussing the book Sapiens, A Brief History of Humankind. Over the past few videos, we tried to understand the origins of this species called humans, the varieties of human species, and how Homo sapien is just one. Then we also went about to understand how cognitive revolution gave us ability for language, and that in turn enabled us to develop vast networks and institutions that allowed for large-scale human cooperation, which in turn turned out to be the differentiating factor of humans compared to other animals. And then we also tried to understand the life in that early period. How was life of humans between 70,000 years ago and 12,000 years ago when they finally invented agriculture. So we discussed how hunter-gatherers in fact had a much better life. The quality of life was better in quite a few aspects than the life of a farmer. Today, we'll close the first unit. This will be a very short video. We'll try to understand what was, yes, humans were developing, they were spreading, but what was the ecological footprint? What was the ecological impact of humans in these early years between 70,000 to 10,000 years when they started traveling from Africa and started to spread across the world? How did they impact the new ecosystems and the new flora and fauna that they came in contact with? And if we have to make an appraisal of all this, it looks like humans are very, very guilty as charged. Our record of ecological impact is in fact very, very destructive. Let's see how that happened. Until cognitive revolution, humans were, by and large, they were largely in Africa and then they moved to Asia. That's about it. There were vast other swaths of land which were beyond their reach, like the Americas, Australia, and the huge number of islands, Indonesia, Pacific Islands, Madagascar, so on. Because these vast swaths of land, to get there, you could not just walk. You needed some swimming abilities. You needed skills that let you cross over. So this is called as outer world, outside the Afro-Asian landmass, and this was beyond humans' reach. But something happened about 45,000 years ago. Around 45,000 years ago, these human population who were living in Indonesian archipelago developed some kind of seafaring abilities, like constructing small vessels and adapting to sea weather. This gave them the ability to sail across the seas from Indonesian islands, Indonesian archipelago into Australia. And thus, Australia, a huge landmass which was hitherto untouched, remained pristine, was opened to humans. Now, whenever humans entered these new ecosystems, they just didn't adapt. That's the sad part. They just didn't adapt to the new ecosystems, but their effect was very destructive. They tried to reinvent the food chains and disturb them. Let us see what happened in Australia. According to Harari, the crossing of humans into Australia is one of the most important events of history, at least as important as Christopher Columbus's discovery of the new land, the new world, and maybe as important as also the Apollo 2 mission, which successfully went on to the moon. So crossing over to Australia was a breakthrough to humankind because they now realized they could cross seas. So crossing space today is what is like crossing seas back then. So this was a huge achievement. And when they entered Australia, this ecosystem was, in general, when any other animal creature enters the ecosystem, it adapts to it. After all, the ecosystem is too big for one individual organism to change it. But humans were not like that. When they entered Australia, they changed They transformed the ecosystem, they modified the food chain, and this caused a huge destruction. In particular, the destruction was particularly acute with respect to large animals, giant beasts. If according to one record, around a few thousand years ago, there were at least, the record is that half of these wild beasts which were large in size were wiped out due to this human expansion, especially into Australia and into the New World, the North and Southern America. So whenever they went here, they caused great destruction, and at the receiving end of this destruction, was these large beasts. Please note this. Around cognitive revolution, around 70,000 years ago, there were at least 200 genera of large terrestrial animals, 200 genera. But around agricultural revolution, by 12,000 years ago, there were half 100 genera. So huge extinction of the planet's big beasts happened. We see very few, we still have some biodiversity, we do, don't we? But the large animals that lived and that walked on this planet were the worst hit by human expansion and human change in life. For example, in Australia is a land of what we call as marsupials. Marsupials are these animals that have, where the infant is very dependent on the mother, that the mother has some kind of a carry bag, a bag, where the infant is held for a large part of its early years. Kangaroo is a marsupial, we all know. So these marsupials are a class of animals which are largely found only in Australia. You don't find them in Asia and Africa. These were wiped out. For example, let us take a look at some of the animals that were wiped out. For example, giant kangaroos. We do have kangaroos, but a few 1,000 years ago, there were giant kangaroos. They were wiped out. So is this marsupial lion. That was also unique to Australia. That was wiped out. This is an animal called as Diprotodon. Diprotodon is also a large bear-like animal. That was also wiped out. So even this giant sloths, sorry, this is not a sloth, this is a giant rodent. Even this was wiped out. So you see, many other animals, I just took a few illustrations, but there were quite a few other. So many of these large animals which lived on this planet were vastly hit thanks to human colonialization of Australia. Now, there are various theories that try to explain how did this come about. One school, tries to be very lenient on humans. They say, after all, climate change is what has caused this destruction and not human activity. But is that true? That sounds like a very weak argument, because climate change, the planet's climate has been in constant flux. The recent climate change is a threat because of its very rapid nature and of the contribution humans made to it. But otherwise, Earth's climate has been periodically changing. It was never constant. It was always in a flux. But so even earlier we had glacials and interglacials, but other such climate changes did not kill animals in such a large scale. So if we see, what we see is a large destruction of animals coinciding with human entry into these hitherto untouched areas like islands and North Americas. So what does that mean? It's certainly not climate, isn't it? It has to do with something like that is human activity. Next, the other important question that also hits us is, after all, humans at that time were not like humans now. They didn't have, huge guns and all this technological weaponry which they could use to destroy. They were only Stone Age people. They only had Stone Age technology. And yet, how could they cause such ecological destruction? Let us see some ideas that help us to understand that. First, most of these large animals, they breed very slowly. So when you see large animals, they don't breed like others, like mosquitoes or hens. No, large animals breed very slowly, and the gestation period of the infant baby is very long, and even after that they have huge gap between one birth and another. So they're not multiplying at a rapid scale. So once, even with stone tools, you start killing one animal by one, over a period of time, it leads to dwindling of the numbers. And as an extension of this idea, in other parts of the world like Asia and Africa, humans and the local fauna, they evolved together. Just as humans were evolving from apes, other animals were also evolving. So there was some interaction between these two species. Because of that, other animals in those original areas where humans evolved, like Africa and Asia, had some knowledge of human behavior. So if they saw a human, they would run away because they developed fear that this man is a hunter, he hunts me. So they had fear, and that fear made them run away and save themselves. But in places like Australia or North Americas, it was not like that. The animals there evolved independently of humans, because humans were never there in Australia in the first place for a long time. So the animal world there developed independently of humans, and when this new animal entered this untouched areas, the other animals did not know how to respond to this. They did not have this inculcated behavior or response of fear in them. So they didn't run away when they saw a human. That made them all the more vulnerable. They didn't learn to escape. That made them all the more vulnerable. And the second factor is humans mastered fire agriculture by this time. By 45,000 years ago, humans mastered fire agriculture, which means they could burn down forests at their will. And this burning and clearing of forests also means that large number of animals could die in a very short span of time, because you are now burning the entire swaths. That leads to also death of animals. What is the proof? For example, eucalyptus. It's a fire resistant plant. Before humans entered Australia, eucalyptus was not a native species there. But we see fossil record of eucalyptus only after the period that humans went to Australia. And how did this eucalyptus plant multiply? Probably because it was fire resistant. You burn down a large swath of land, other plants and grasses would just be burnt, but eucalyptus would still be there because it was fire resistant. That gave it an advantage, and hence eucalyptus rapidly grew in Australia, which was not its original native place. The other theory goes easy again on humans. It says, see, around 45,000 years ago, Australia was also going through some climate change. There was some climate change episode there. At this juncture, when there was also climate change, humans entered. So the combination of climate change and human hunting and human activity resulted in this death of this fauna. It is not just human activity alone, but it's a combination of both. This is the other theory. Now, so clearly we see, right, in Australia, very pristine area, human-centered, we see a lot of destruction. This was not restricted to Australia. This continued even in America. It happened slightly later compared to Australia. Sapiens, how did Sapiens first get to America? We showed an interesting diagram in the first or second video, right, with a lot of arrows showing how humans spread. So humans entered America from Siberia. They entered from northeastern Siberia into northwestern Alaska. How did they come? You have a narrow straits there called Bering Straits. Now, when there was an ice age, these straits were frozen. So the ice was frozen, the seas were frozen, which created what we call as land bridges, swaths of ice that connected two neighboring pieces of land. So that made it possible for humans to cross over from Siberia, which is in Asia, to Alaska, which is in America. And this event happened about 14,000 BC, that is 16,000 years ago, or happened around 14,000 BC. After entering Alaska, Alaska was full of glaciers, and after 1,000 years, around 1,000 to around 12,000 BC, I think, these glaciers started melting away. That opened another route for these early humans to move from Alaska into the more warmer tropical parts of America. Through that way, they moved from Alaska to the delta of Mississippi, to the deserts of Mexico, to the jungles of Central America, and the Amazon, the thick jungles of Amazon basin, and the valleys of Andes, to eventually reach the pampas of Argentina. This is how they colonized America around, and the event happened just in 2000 years. By around 10,000 BC, we see that humans have settled even at the southernmost tip of South America. So in 2000, just in 2 millennia, a species has colonized 2 continents. This has never happened before in the planet's history. So it was kind of a very, very rapid colonization. And just like the story in Australia, this colonization in its aftermath also created destruction to the native species. North America, the species in North America also evolved independently because this was an untouched world. They evolved independently, and it was North America, South America, the Americas were home to many giant species of animals, and these also vanished in a very short span of time after humans have colonized these areas. For example, this is a picture of a ground sloth. We see sloths, right? They are small, the sloths we see today. But at some point, we had giant sloths like this, and these have become extinct. So did the mammoth. A mammoth is a much bigger variant of an elephant. You see, right? Very long tusks. Very long tusk. So even this animal became extinct. So did this animal. This animal is a rodent. So this is a rodent. Rodents today are like small rats, isn't it? We think of them as rats, but at one point of time they were giant rodents. This is very big, the size of a pig, perhaps a very big pig. So giant rodents also became extinct. So did saber-toothed cat. We have saber-toothed tiger. Likewise, we also had saber-toothed cat. All of these became extinct. We don't find evidence of these, living evidence of them today. All because of human activity in this human entry into these areas, these pristine areas. So wherever we went, there was very big destruction. Look at this data. In North America, North America lost about 34 out of its 47 genera of large animals. So in North America, 34 out of 47 have become extinct. In South America, it was much worse. 50 out of 60 became extinct. So that was the kind of impact we had on these large animals. And so what can we say? Overall, about half of the planet's big beasts became extinct even before we took up farming. The story gets much worse after we became farmers and after we took up industrial revolution. But even before that, our ecological impact was very, very destructive. And I took the most famous examples are in Australia and the Americas. But there are more other examples, like in the Pacific Oceans, Solomon Islands, Fiji Islands, Samoa. All these islands also have similar experience, and even Madagascar. So all these islands which developed very independently of the larger world, and they started losing their rich biodiversity and unique adaptations of animals when humans began entering. Very few other species survived. Very few other islands survived which were pristine, like Galapagos, a very rare example. Galapagos, the island of Galapagos did not see human settlements until 19th century. So the fauna there was very, very different and rich. In fact, that fact drew Darwin to Galapagos. Darwin wanted to go to Galapagos to do his research, and it was through his research and data he collected from Galapagos Island, he gave his theory of natural selection. So that's how much biological value these islands which are untouched from humans have. But unfortunately, when humans enter, it leads to some damage. It's not like we have done this once. We humans throughout their history have repeated this destructive activity. So broadly, we can see that animals went through 3 waves of human caused extinction. The first wave was as the foragers, the hunters spread. The second wave was when the farmers spread, when farming was taken up and they began spreading their way of life. The third wave of extinction is what we are living through now, the industrial activity. It is causing damage that was not caused ever before. Most importantly, earlier the other 2 waves of extinction only killed terrestrial animals. The aquatic life was by and large left on its own. But in industrial activity, it is not even sparing those aquatic animals. Our destructive capacity is also making us cause damage to the aquatic animals. So large is this third wave of extinction. If this continues, the living giants like whales and sharks, which are living now, we don't no longer find giant beasts on land. We do find some giant beasts in the seas and oceans like the whale. If we keep living like this, probably the fate of the whales, sharks and tuna and dolphins will also be like those of diprotodons, the ground sloths and the mammoths. They will slip away into oblivion. And at the end, if we have to, when there is the real destructive event, and if we have to really, the flood, the popular flood in the Bible, if the flood like that happens, and if we have to create a Noah's Ark to survive it, then probably all that will be left is only humans and the few farmyard animals they have saved. What are the farmyard animals? Our meat sources, cattle, some poultry, that's it. Only these few species will survive and the rest will probably be extinct. We'll only have a few hens and a few cattle and a few dogs to take with us into that ark to save away, to live the damage of massive destruction. So that could be our fate. We should not be like this. So the author concludes by asking us, is human an ecological serial killer? He thinks that is so. What do you think? Please think about it. And we'll take up the next topic, that is agriculture and how it changed life. I'll leave you with a clue. Harari calls agriculture history's biggest fraud. He's calling it history's biggest fraud. Is it really a fraud or not? What are your thoughts? We'll see you again with the next video. Until then, goodbye. Thank you.